Now, I have a lot of fun when I come up with like the subtitles for these programs. And I know you're probably looking at this saying the development that did, where does that come from? Well, the only thing I could think of is like that whole story of the train that could, the train going up the hill, and they think I can, and then, at the end, the train did it. The train made it up the hill. And that's the thing with this development. It finally did happen. Now, what's interesting about this development, and I'm sure that we have people in the audience this evening that remember it, there were many times when we really wondered whether or not this was actually going to happen. And the original plan for the development and what actually happened is something, it's two different developments almost. And so that's the thing that I find really interesting, that when you look at Arcadia Creek, Arcadia Commons now, it certainly was nothing like what it had first projected to be back in 1983. So that's why I call it the development that finally did. Before I get going this evening, I do want to thank the illustrations, or the photographs that you see here come not only from the archives at Western Michigan University, some of them come from the Kalamazoo Gazette collection, which we currently have at the archives. But also I want to thank the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. There were a couple images that Paula Metzner sent me. And then also the Kalamazoo Public Library. Beth opened up some of her photos and brought them in and from the creek. And she also had on top of the box a photo of me 30 years ago, which is really very interesting when you see that. I don't know if I shared it with Sharon. She already saw that. When you look at Arcadia Creek, I had a very interesting introduction to the creek. And this was back in 1978 during the blizzard. I think those of you who were in Kalamazoo might remember what that blizzard was like in January of 1978. And I was a student at Western Michigan University, living in West Campus Apartments, which was on Lafayette Street. And my roommate and I decided that we were going to cross the field and go to Stadium Drive and walk to the old A&P that was next to the Kmart down there. And so we got to this body of water, and I had absolutely no idea what it was. And my roommate was a little more agile than I was, and she decided that she was going to jump over it. And she did. She made it just fine. I was a little apprehensive. I should have watched when I listened to her, because she said to me, "Oh, don't worry, Lynn, it's frozen. You're not going to have a problem." So I tried jumping. Let's just say my effort was not as successful as Jill's. I fell in the creek. So my first introduction to Arcadia Creek was falling into it in January of 1978. And yes, getting out of the creek, and still, you know how you are when you're a student, sometimes you do things and then you look back and you think, why did I do it? Walking down Stadium Drive with wet, frozen feet. But anyway, I did get that gallon of milk, and that was important. But anyway, so that was my introduction to Arcadia Creek. Who knew 20 years later that less than 20 years later, that I would become very actively involved. And my personal involvement, my professional involvement, was in what I refer to as phase 2. And you'll understand what I'm getting at there when we look at it. Okay, I want to make sure this is on. Yes, it is on. Good. When you look at why people came to Kalamazoo, what brought them to Kalamazoo and Kalamazoo County, obviously it was the land that brought them together. It was the land that attracted them. But where they wanted to locate, they wanted to locate near water. And one of those bodies of water, of course, we have more than just one creek. We have several creeks that flow into the Kalamazoo River. The one we're going to feature today, of course, is Arcadia. And this is in Elm Street Park in the Stewart neighborhood, and this is a small section of it that's open. We know that the area, the water attracted this fine gentleman, Titus Bronson. This is a photograph that was taken by Schuyler Baldwin from the original painting that is now at the Kalamazoo Valley Museum of Kalamazoo in 1832. And it shows Titus's cabins, which were located on the corner of North Park and Water Street, where the Cancer Center is right now. And one of the reasons it says that he located his cabins there in the spring of 1831 was because of the location of the creek. And I was trying to see if I could see it in this picture. And I don't think it's right up here in the front. Who knows? I don't know. But I always wonder if this is the picture that gave my young daughter Jennifer, who came to a meeting with me on Arcadia Creek. She had never seen this picture before, but she was about 3 years old at the time when she came with me to have a meeting at DKI. And she decided unbeknownst to what this picture is, that what the Arcadia Creek development needed were more sheep and more pigs. And when Beth saw me with these, she wondered what they were. Well, I got an inspiration when I came in this evening because she's now 25 years old, and I had to remember when she was 3 years old, and this was her contribution to the development. Now, she obviously had no idea that originally there were pigs and sheep and other things around the creek, but she didn't know that back in the 1990s that's what it would have. So Beth, that's why I brought my sheep and my pig. It's interesting when you look at the course of the creek, and this is from the 1874 bird's eye view map, which both Sharon used in her first program and I used 2 weeks ago. Now, I colored it, but you can see this is Michigan Avenue, or what we know as Stadium Drive. Here is Asylum, which is Oakland, and the creek actually originates out in Ashtimo Township, and then is parallel to the railroad tracks, as you can see here. And it's interesting when you see it because you can see it coming down, going the original course, running along the tracks, and then you'll see that it empties into what was known as Bennett's Pond. And here around Allen Boulevard, so smack dab in the middle of the Stewart neighborhood. And here's the Stewart neighborhood around in here. And then you'll see it continues its course to the east. And on the bird's eye map, I sort of lose it right here. I wasn't really able to pick it up. Where you can really see it is in the 1873 County Atlas, which is a year before that bird's eye view map. Now, I tried to get as much as I could, but here we have again, it's coming down what we know, of course, as Stadium Drive. Now, at this time in 1873, at the intersection of Stadium Drive and Oakland Drive, we had a brewery, we had a few other businesses here, and so we have a pond, which I'm sure is powering it some way. Here we have again, it's continuing, here it is around West Main Street right here. Here's Academy, okay, no, I'm sorry, here's West Main up here. I was wrong on that. Here's Academy, okay, and you can see it continuing, and then let's look at it here. And here we have it again, near Bennett's Pond. One of the things, of course, that the creek did is it let into not only Bennett's Pond, but Mirror Lake, which was over near Kalamazoo College, and also something called the Ice Box, which was near Himes Field. These ponds would be for recreation. You could fish, you could ice skate, and courtesy of the Kalamazoo Valley Museum, we actually have some photographs. They actually have some photographs of Bennett's Pond. I'm not quite sure of the date of these, but I was a glutton for punishment, and I decided to put all 3 photographs in. How could you choose which is the best one? If I had a little more time, I would have been able to figure out the direction of these. Here's another view of Bennett's Pond. And here's another view. And as we did before with that 1874 map, you can see it a little bit better as it is continuing here into the downtown area. Here's Rose Street, here's Burdick Street. You can see it powered a lumber yard. It continued going up and eventually deposited into the Kalamazoo River. And here is a photo that was taken probably in the late 70s, early 80s of Arcadia Creek, or at least this is what the Kalamazoo Gazette said was Arcadia Creek going into the river. We know one of the things that Arcadia Creek was used for was to fight fires. This is an early photograph of a volunteer fire company. This is, if I'm not mistaken, the Germania Fire Company. But when you read the Compendium in History of Kalamazoo County in 1906, it does say here, not only we had a wool carding plant that was powered by water from Arcadia, but then also it talks about the race or the flume, which had a gate. It was closed for the operations of the bucket brigade, which would be used to fight the fires. It then goes on to talk a little bit more about how periodically in other sections of Arcadia Creek, how it was used to supply water for the fire engines. Now this would have been before the Civil War and probably before 1869 when we had the Holly water system. The other thing I thought was interesting when you look at the early history of Arcadia Creek is that it talks about what the Michigan Central Railroad did. Now the Michigan Central Railroad came in around 1842, 1843, and how They needed water for their operations, and what do? They put pipes from the creek to the railroad station. Now, if you keep reading this, it's interesting, because then what they do is the village needs water, so then they build pipes to go from the railroad station back to around the county courthouse area where they had water. So they're all using the water of Arcadia Creek. So we have it where it's being used for recreation. We have it being used for firefighting. During these early years also too, it's also being used to power factories and industry. We talked about the wool, let's go back. We talked about the wool carding plant. 1854, they talk about this woodworking shop and this gentleman that actually, I think it was between Rose and Burdick Street at that time, they said, that he even dammed it up to try to create some more power. And then, again, didn't have time to do a lot of work on this one, but I would be interested to find out if the Lawrence and Gale Foundry was a forerunner of the Lawrence Iron Works by William Lawrence. And when this building was built in 1872, it had been said that he located the building there because he wanted to use the power of the creek just to the north of the building. Whether or not that was the case, I don't really know, because by that time we would have had the Holly water system already in operation. So I think you're getting a little feel about the role of the creek in Kalamazoo history. Things began to change probably around the turn of they say things changed around the turn of the 20th century when, and obviously this is not a picture from that time period, but how the creek was boxed up and used as a sewer and for things other than to power manufacturing. But even earlier than that, I found this in the Kalamazoo Gazette, and I thought this was really interesting. A notice in the circuit court papers about what was happening to the proprietors for these two hotels because of what they were doing. And what were they doing back in 1874, even as early as 1874, emptying their sewers into the creek. So the creek being I won't say, being known as being like a sewer is something that started way before 1900. Then, of course, we deal with the issue of flooding. Now, the Kalamazoo Gazette, on the back of it, this identified it as West Main. And does this look like West Main? Yeah. Okay, all right. I think probably it's a little bit farther up, because then okay. But then J.R. Jones, I guess, would probably be, or not, but the Jones would be up there farther. Okay. Further. And for those of you that have lived in Kalamazoo 30 to 35, maybe even 40 years ago, you remember what it was like when you did have heavy flooding. And it would be like this. So they were dealing with issues of flooding. But even back in 1880, even earlier than the 1970s and the 1980s, you had statements in the newspaper that talked about the problems with flooding and what was happening in the Arcadia Creek area. The Gale block that is spoken about in this excerpt is a building, if I'm not mistaken, it was on North Burdick Street. I think it is the building that was known as the Kalamazoo Boxing Academy on the corner of Eleanor and North Burdick Street. It was either that one or I don't think it was the Globe Casket building. But anyway, so here they're talking about their basement over there is being filled with water. So issues of the creek being used as a sewer, issues of flooding. Here's another picture. Now I know, we even had, this is Academy Street. You may remember, and this was sort of like, I love doing this program because I'm sort of tripping down memory lane, and I remember Schwartz's over here. So when you see something like this, you think of something other than flooding. You begin to think about, oh, that great dinner I had, that Reuben sandwich was really good. I think one of our early dates was there, David, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway. But this is Academy Street, obviously impact from the creek, but Academy Street still gets flooded. If you have a major rainstorm, it's still going to get flooded. But these issues of the creek being boxed up, the creek getting underground, the creek being used as a sewer, the creek flooding, is something that had been going on for a very, very long time. In 1975, they said it was so bad that culverts were destroyed. Now, I don't know if this is the one. I kept looking at this one to see if it was where I thought it was. But they said that there was the rain collapsed a culvert near St. A's. And I'm quite not sure if that's where that is or not. But the flooding was getting really bad. And so it culminated in something that obviously impacted the neighborhood, and that was in 1975 when the federal government declared this. Official floodway, official floodplain, but not just in the downtown, obviously other areas, including the Stewart neighborhood. Now, Mark, was it the entire neighborhood or just certain sections?
No, I don't think that the whole, that a large part of Stewart was in the floodplain until, probably 87 or 88, something like that.
Okay, so it was after the 1975 declaration.
Right, yes, later than that.
Okay, so you can see the impact that this also had on the neighborhood. Couple interesting things in the 1970s. Well, you know, the city puts it on their master plan, and it was interesting that the director of public works already talked about how much money it would take to improve the creek, and they were already beginning to think about maybe developing the creek in some way to make it some type of center for downtown development. And then 4 years later, you had this annual conference that was meeting in Kalamazoo, and they had 6 different teams, and they had some very important architects that came to Kalamazoo for this conference, including Frank Gehry. And it was interesting that all the design teams somehow incorporated the creek in their design. Also in the 1970s, they were looking at extending the Kalamazoo Mall to the north, and one of the proposals was to open the creek. So people were beginning to think about making this more an amenity and not so much a sewer. In 1980, there was a group that was formed, there was a very large group of citizens that gathered to look at the future of the community. It was called Kalamazoo 2000. I don't know if any of you here were a member of it or not. Very similar to what they did in 1960 when they did a program called Kalamazoo 1980. Summary report 3 years later, and it was interesting because there were a number of committees. And there were 2 people in particular, Blaine Lamb and Evie Askin, who were part of the Economic Development Committee. They were on a subcommittee called the Quality of Life. And they made a proposal to actually look at developing Arcadia Creek and making it a center and making it a linkage to the downtown, to the neighborhoods, to the colleges, and to the universities. And that came out in 1983. Well, it's interesting how all of this began to go forward, because a year earlier, the Downtown Development Authority was formed, the DDA. Due to state law, communities could form these organizations who would be responsible for, primarily, as you can see, downtown planning and development. They would be funded by a tax on certain areas, and so that's where you will hear communities creating downtown authority, downtown DDA districts. And not long before, well, actually it was before that summary report came out, Blaine Lamb and Evie Askin made their proposal, and the DDA decided to accept this as what they saw as a goal in the development of Arcadia Creek. Well, I sort of divided this up into phase 1 and phase 2, because I think that's probably how this whole thing came down. I don't think they thought it would be like this. But the first phase, what the Downtown Development Authority did is they got 6 different design firms from around the United States to make proposals of what would they do in that area. And in the end, the group that was chosen was Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill out of Chicago. And they started there, when they got the award, it came down in October of 1983, and they issued their study in January of 1984. Their plan was very extensive, and it included a lot of different things. What they had suggested for this is opening up the channel of Arcadia Creek. There would be a fountain, there would be a conservatory. It was a combination of office buildings and housing. So housing was a very big element. And so you had the conservatory over here, just to give you a sort of perspective. that would be approximately where the festival site is right now. So that's what one of their proposals would be. Housing would sort of merge into where the Stewart neighborhood would be. So it was the whole thing of sort of tying in housing to link it to the neighborhood. But it was dotted with office buildings and other features. Of course, you can see the trees that they have and other amenities there. They projected that the total project would take 10 to 15 years to produce and would cost $46 million. So that was their proposal. They also had, here's some other, this comes from the report. You can see the conservatory a little bit more, the details of maybe open markets, gardens, whatever. I mean, and here you have the open creek. Of course, obviously, I don't know if I have it here. No, I don't. I had one picture. Obviously, this was heavily influenced by San Antonio, Texas. All you heard was what San Antonio, Texas had done with the Riverwalk. And that seemed to have an appeal here in Kalamazoo. And I think, as with a lot of communities, if San Antonio can do it, we can do this too. Let's take our water and make it some type of amenity. So how do you do that? Well, obviously, one of the ways that you're going to do this is where are you going to get the funding? Well, one of the other organization, and this is the thing everybody talked about in the 1980s and 90s, the Ds. Well, we've already talked about the DDA. The other one that I forgot to mention was the DKA, the Downtown Kalamazoo Association. Now, that was a group of business owners in the downtown area that really started in the 1950s. But we've talked about the DDA. Then you had an organization like this in 1983 that was created, the DTI. Now, this was going to be a private organization. They raised the money, and their goal was to buy the property. And of course, then they would turn the property over to whoever developer would be there. And their first purchase was the Kalamazoo Laundry site. Okay. But the whole success of this project was not the city per se, but a developer coming in and doing what Skidmore, Owings & Merrill suggested. There was a realization that for this program to succeed, there would have to be citizen support. So the Arcadia Creek Alliance formed 2 years later. In fact, I saw that I think Beth has got a great number of their newsletters, maybe all of them. And one of their big goals was to create awareness, create support for whatever might be needed. And they were faced with this indication right here of just a little over a third of people who were probably even aware that Arcadia Creek really existed. Now, I don't know if that was the creek or the development. So there were about 60 people who were a member of Arcadia Creek Alliance, and they did serve as public speakers that would go out and talk to people about this plan, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. And there were several things that they decided to do in this stage. Now, why am I showing a picture of this church? Because I don't know if there's anybody in here. David and I attended, I don't know, Sharon, if you attended, the town hall meeting in November of 1985?
No, I was not there, but
okay.
The neighborhood office was in that church at that time.
Well,
there's a connection there.
there is a connection, because one of the members of the Arcadia Creek Alliance, if I'm not mistaken, was the administrator of the Stewart Area Restoration Association. And so they decided, the Arcadia Creek Alliance decided to put together this town hall meeting where people could learn about the project, if anything, decided to whip up support for this project. It was a very interesting exercise, because I will say it was one of the, well, it was broadcast, excerpts were broadcast on Channel 41, Channel 4 now, and then they had the entire meeting shown on public access. But it was interesting because a lot of the questions were staged. And I can remember quite well sitting in the back of there, just sort of holding my head in my hand, because you knew exactly, I mean, there were some questions that were spontaneous, but there were some questions that were planted in the audience, and different people would go up and say, now tell me, how are we supposed to fund this project? You know, that type of thing. But it was an attempt. They were the Arcadia Creek Alliance was undertaking a media campaign, among many other things, to try to raise awareness of this project. The other thing they had in 1986 was this: Free the Creek Week. Hot dogs, they had balloons, they had posters, they had all kinds of activities for the public to learn about the creek. And they also funded this, a book that was illustrated by David Small, who I don't know if he wants to admit that he did this or not. But it came out, and it was an interesting book to, and you might find copies of it down occasionally in the Friends bookstore. You can still find extra copies around. It was great because, and they would show, like here we have Titus, even though here we have Titus. They even put pronunciations in there. And you can see the creek was really happy because the creek is open and it's happy. And then eventually, as the years go by and it becomes more of a sewer, whatever, it looks really sad. Now the illustration that I don't have is when it opens up again and it's really happy again. It has a happy smile. There were 6 school districts that, and of course the book was free to whoever wanted it, and there were 6 school districts that accepted the book and gave them to, it was mostly an elementary school age student that received the book. But there was a controversy behind that because of the lesson plan that went with the book, and I'll never forget it because there were questions for discussions, and the classic question was, okay, you need to go home and tell your parents why the creek needs to be open. You know, I remember it was something like that. I'm probably paraphrasing it. But there was an article that was written by some individuals who thought that it was not exactly the best approach to go, would be to appeal to an audience like that. But obviously, Free the Creek and David Small's book and other things did raise the awareness because by 1986, you can see how the percentage had increased with people being aware of Arcadia Creek. And so by a year later, the final design by Skidmore is released, and you can see what they call Phase 1 and how much it would cost the taxpayers. Now the cost to the taxpayers was mainly because of the creek, the work that needed to be done on the creek. And that's what this money would go for, creek work. It was interesting that in this final design, for some reason, all the housing was gone. The element of housing had been removed from the Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill plan. And so anyway, so this is what they were faced with. Yes, 71% of residents were now aware, but this is what the bottom line was going to be as far as how much it was going to cost the taxpayers. So you were dealing with the issue of funding the project. They did go out and look for grants. They did find one grant, and that grant was the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund. And they got money for it. I think it was like maybe about $100,000. But that was about it as far as grants up to this point. Potential participants, well, there had been a few people that had been interested in maybe poking their toe in the water. Probably the biggest one was the Upjohn Company, which had the time of their centennial in 1986 said that they wanted to build a museum. They were no longer doing tours, or they were getting away from the company tours, and so they were talking about building a museum in downtown Kalamazoo. And wouldn't that be a good thing for Arcadia Creek? They talked about, of course, here we go, taxpayer funds. How are they going to approach the taxpayers? But the biggest thing was potential developers. They were still hoping that one developer would come in and they would handle that entire project. Taxpayer funds, well, that wasn't exactly a good time for it. There were a couple things that happened in the 1980s. 1979, of course, the citizens voted in favor of rail consolidation and the money in favor of rail consolidation. And you might remember it didn't happen all of a sudden because, of course, the costs increased. And by 1984, there was an issue on the ballot for the charter of the city of Kalamazoo that would limit the amount of time that a bond could be spent. And then in 1985, when the city went back to the voters to refund rail consolidation, it got turned down. As far as the city income tax, it was at this same time that they were also talking about putting an issue before the voters for a city income tax, and it was decided not to do that. So how could they go to the voters and ask them for $9 million for creek work when rail consolidation failed and they weren't going to go for an income tax? The other thing was potential developers. It's real interesting in retrospect. When I happened to do a lot of research on this project, back in the mid-1990s, and I interviewed some people, and there was one individual who said that they really had hoped that a single developer would come in, but they realized now that that Kalamazoo was too small of a community to attract a very large developer. And it was too large for like a local developer to handle it. So I think that they realized quite quickly that that wasn't going to happen. And so by June of 1988, all work was halted. Phase 1. So what happened in phase 2? Well, this is where some of us in the room became involved. A couple things happened in phase 2. One of the things that they decided to do was reorganize as far as who was doing what. And there were a group of individuals that decided to create a different organization. And that's where the other D word came in, Downtown Kalamazoo Incorporated, or DKI. And that was, as I said, an umbrella for these 3 organizations. And this organization would be involved with a lot of things, whether it be development, whether it be funding, whether it be providing services for the downtown area. The other thing that came on board was another interesting way of being able to fund this project, and that was TIF funding, or tax increment financing. I won't go into a lot of great detail, but it basically meant that you would create a TIF district and capture 80% of new development. And one of the newest developments going on at this time was a new Upjohn Company building. So they were able to tap into that. So they're looking at a different organization and a different way possibly of funding it. Instead of one big developer coming in, we now have a number of participants that line up that are interested in building in the Arcadia Creek project area. First and foremost, KVCC, which had had a downtown campus since 1982, but if you remember where that downtown campus was located, it was located in a parking ramp. Not in the parking ramp per se, but in an office in the parking ramp, the Jacobson's parking ramp, facing East South Street. So they were looking for a new home. First of America. Any of you remember First of America? It's sort of hard to remember First of America with all the banks that it has become, how it has been taken over by several different banks. But First of America wanted to combine a lot of their offices in the downtown area. The Kalamazoo Public Museum, now the Kalamazoo Valley Museum, was looking for a new home, and they were also going through a change as far as who was governing them. Eventually, the West Michigan Cancer Center, which was a joint effort of Bronson and Borges hospitals, which had originally planned on building off the expressway, start looking in the downtown area. And finally, Scott Dorschler, Messner, and Gauntlet, which was an investment firm that was also looking for new. So those were the 5 main partners. Also, too, when they looked at Arcadia Creek, they had really scaled down the plans, and it was down now to about $7 million for creek work. And they were looking, as you see here, more storm sewer than making it more like San Antonio. And they were going to use that trust fund grant to do a festival site. So instead of a conservatory, instead of gardens, they talked about a festival site. So things had changed a little bit, and I think that there was some hope that things would speed up. A couple things. Of course, the Upjohn Company had talked about building a conference center, but then what happened? They purchased the Kalamazoo Center. Kalamazoo Center in 1990 was close to bankruptcy, and it was thought that it would endanger the Arcadia Creek project if somebody didn't take hold of it. And so the Upjohn Company did, so they didn't need a separate conference center. They had it right there. As far as getting community input, we didn't really have the Arcadia Creek, well, no, I think Arcadia Creek Alliance was still around, but a team was formed that Sharon and I were a part of, called the Project Enhancement Team. And it was an interesting experience. It went on for about 9 months. And we got together once a week. And it was an interesting thing because, I don't know if you remember this, Sharon, it seemed like every week we went there, somebody was in a different place. They kept shifting where the partners would go. Would KVCC go here? Would KVCC go there? One of the more interesting meetings that I went to was the proposal one day when we were in, and somebody made the proposal of moving the Lawrence and Chapin building, the Vermeulen's furniture building, over to the next corner, so it's on Water and North Rose. They wanted to physically move it over to Eleanor and North Rose Street, or even they wanted to move it over, I can't remember how many feet, because they wanted to be able to see the south facade of the building. Until we pointed out that if you do something like that, you're going to endanger its National Registry I don't know, we just had interesting meetings. But anyway, so it was a way of gathering community input. The other impact, the other thing, they did get funding. They got $1 million from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to work on creek work, the UDAG Action Grant. There was some, I don't want to say interesting, but there were some challenges and issues that the developers, DKI, faced, and in some cases, things that they never really anticipated. One of them was environmental. When you look at what was on the area where the Arcadia Creek project is located now, there were some, light industrial, there were some other buildings in there, and so what they found is that they had some major environmental issues. This is a picture from Beth's collection at the local history room, and it's the best I could get of the Kalamazoo laundry buildings. Now these buildings, just across the parking lot from the Vermeulen's building on North Rose Street, and these were buildings that had been purchased by DKI. And the thing about the Kalamazoo laundry building is it was found that it was full of lovely things, and I'm being sarcastic. It was full of asbestos, it was full of cleaning fluids, the thing that they found with the laundry building is that there were 5 underground tanks below that had a lot of these materials. And so there were going to be some major work that was going to have to be done to prepare this property. Across the street, you had Weber Tool and Engineering, and you had metal stamping that was going on in here. So not just here, but then also when you historically looked at what had the buildings that had been on many of these sites, you were dealing with a lot of different things. You had petroleum, you had metal stampings, you had foundry sand, you had cinders, you had heavy metals, just a great deal of contaminants. The other thing that the developers, or that DKI were working with, are how the law would be changing, and laws would be changed by the Department of Natural Resources as far as what you had to do to clean up this property. And in many cases, in the final go-around, they might be done paying for it. I'm really not too sure. For example, with the Kalamazoo laundry building, soil was dug down to 14 feet and carted away. The groundwater on site was, because it was contaminated, the city had to pump groundwater and clean it for 20 years. The total cost of cleaning the Kalamazoo laundry site was close to $500,000. That was not something that they had anticipated when they looked at all of this. I think they knew that there was going to be a little bit. I don't think they really quite knew, and I got that from some of the people that I talked to. In a lot of cases, the partners have a ground lease for the land. The city actually owns the land. I think they still might, I should check on that, still own some of the land, and then the partners or whoever owns these buildings actually lease it. So for example, that happened with the old Vermeulen's building, the Lawrence and Chapin building, because they did some borings in the building and they found some contaminants, and so actually it was the city that owned the land, but the partners at that point in time, it was First of America, had a ground lease on the property. So environmental posed a very large challenge for this project. Then you get into the issue of property acquisition. There were 3 buildings in particular that were difficult to get a hold of by the partners. Weber right here, the building next to it, and then of course the Shakespeare block on the corner of North Rose and Water Street. They would not sell. And the city was actually looking into the issue of eminent domain. Now it's interesting because how eminent domain has changed. Back then, to qualify to use eminent domain, the city would have to show that it would be to the benefits or to the community's good, that somehow it would benefit the community for the city to acquire this land. And it's interesting, this is a little aside, that's one of the reasons why KVCC is on this location. One of the reasons. I'm sure that there were other ones, but it was important that they wanted to place, and I don't think I'm telling anything that's any great state secret or anything else like that, but they were looking at either putting the museum on this piece of property or KVCC, because that would have helped them with eminent domain. They didn't have to pursue eminent domain with this owner because they settled with the city. With Weber, it was a little bit different. They did go to court with Weber Tool and Engineering, and they did come to a agreement, and I'm not quite sure, I mean, there was money involved, but I thought for sure that there was something also in the agreement where there had to be a picture of Mr. Weber and a plaque or whatever, and I don't think there's anything like that in the museum. Yes, David?
How did they deal with Weber? I mean, they had iron filings in the ground, didn't they?
Yes, there were iron filings.
How did they clean that up?
Well, they may have probably had to cart that away. I'm not quite sure what they did there other than carting away the dirt. We also had some areas too. I mean, look at this photo. When this photo was taken, about what was on this block too. I mean, you had areas of, I don't know if you had any that were gasoline or not. So I mean, that gets into environmental. But anyway, they did not have to go to court with this building, but they did have to have eminent domain with this building. I find it interesting that many years later, you can now use economic development as a reason of eminent domain. And that was as a result of a Supreme Court case that happened about Connecticut, and I think if I'm not mistaken, because of Pfizer, or it was either Pfizer or Pharmacia or whatever. But that was not the case when this happened in the late 1980s. So property acquisition. And one that's near and dear to my heart, and that is historic preservation. And that's how I got involved. This area had a couple historic buildings that were on the National Register. For example, the Masonic Temple, which was built in 1913. And also, of course, the Lawrence and Chapin Building, 1872. Now, this was also on the National Register. In that original Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill design, almost all of the buildings were gone. And historic preservationists did meet with during phase one and come up with a compromise. But then when everything died, I was a member of the commission at the time, we decided to go ahead and pursue National Registry nomination for the entire district. Because we were concerned about other buildings, including this building on the corner, which was the site of a hardware store. You may remember it as Coopson's. This was built, I think, around 1889, maybe a little bit earlier. This was Edwards and Chamberlain hardware store was located here before they moved over to the Haymarket building. Over here we have the Green Building, which is 1867, and next to it is the Phelps and Bigelow Windmill Factory, and that's 1876. So we were concerned about other buildings within that area, not just the Masonic Temple and Vermeulen's, but of course, if that Skidmore plan had gone through, those other buildings were slated to come down. So what we did is we worked out and got grants and hired some consultants who worked on the area, and we did create the Arcadia Creek Historic District. This was a National Register Historic District. And when that UDAG money from the Housing and Urban Development came in, the State Historic Preservation Office in Lansing had to declare whether or not the plan per se would have a negative impact, what sort of impact it would have on the historic district. And when they did say that it would have a negative impact, it kicked in this, which I knew absolutely nothing about, but I learned a lot about it. According to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, when you have that happen, it puts in a review called Section 106. And that was something that the project enhancement team was involved with, so we were involved with that. And with the Section 106 process, the parties have to come to this, an MOA. And in the long run, when it was signed in June of 1990, there were some buildings that came down, but there were some buildings that were saved, and there were two things that historic preservationists got. First and foremost, the city of Kalamazoo had to hire this staff person. And currently right now, Sharon Ferraro is in that role, and she is the 4th person in that position that we've had since 1990. The other thing for the Arcadia Creek, or what was known as the Arcadia Commons area, there was a commission that was formed that would review specifically the new buildings that would come up and the restoration, renovation, adaptive use of the old buildings that were there. And they established guidelines as far as setbacks and materials and size of the building. And so I think that those are probably two of the things that, as a result of the MOA, that were very interesting. So work began in 1990. This is an illustration. You can pretty well date it when you look and see that the Vermeulens, the First of America project has been completed. The Cancer Center has been completed. KVCC is opened up. And you can see construction is going on the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. So this is pre-1996. This may be around 1994, 1995, because the museum hasn't been completed yet. However, the parking ramp has not been completed either. The creek work began quite early on. And one of the things that happened with the creek is the creek obviously looked very different from photographs and drawings that we had been shown on the project enhancement team. They really did put it in a culvert. And I know that there are some people who will look at it sometimes when it's low and wonder, this is it. This is one thing that this wasn't exactly the way it was supposed to look. And I still, when I was getting ready for this program, I was trying to think of what were the reasons for why the creek was put into this. Well, obviously it's prepared for the 100-year flood. That's one thing. But as far as how this was supposed to be the centerpiece for this project and the amenities that it was supposed to have, didn't quite exactly make it. As far as buildings per se, the first building that began was KVCC, their downtown campus. This was designed by the local architectural firm of Tower, Pinkster, and Titus. And you can see that what they tried to do with this is they tried to replicate the arches of the windows from the Vermeulens building across the street. I did get a gentleman from KVCC, an administrator from KVCC, who said in the long run he felt that this building was a lot better from what they had originally planned to put here, which was a very glass box geometric type building. You can see too, because of those standards that are in place, you have a brick building, you have a traditional setback, so KVCC. And they opened up in the fall of 1994. And here's a rear portion of the building. There had been plans that they would expand into this green space over here. They talked about putting some type of auditorium or more classroom buildings, but obviously that has not happened. First of America. This was a project done by Hobbs and Black, started in 1993. You have the Lawrence and Chapin building here. Absolutely gorgeous what they did. You've got that the restoration of the slate roof up at the top with the mansard roof. They kept not only that, but they also kept the 1881 addition in the back, and they also kept the 1940s addition, which they, excuse me, connected to the new building here, also designed, of course, by Hobbs and Black. And you can see how they looked, the decorative cornice and the rounded windows, the detail around the windows, whether or not that was a reflection of the Vermeulens building or also the Masonic Temple across the street, I'm really not too sure. But anyway, but it's a nice addition to the area. Now, it was interesting with this because I remember I said to you that one of the proposals, because of the very ornate south side of the building, had been to actually physically move the Vermeulens building, which that plan didn't last very long. Finally, and I don't know, can't remember exactly when this happened, whether or not it was because of the MOA or just because of the design, they agreed to cut away a portion of the parking ramp. And now the original parking ramp that was built for the Kalamazoo Center is right here. The addition was added a couple years later, and if you remember what it looked like, it certainly didn't look like this. They also chose to reface the parking ramp, parts of it with brick, so it would blend it in the development a little bit more. But they cut enough of it away so you can see at least a portion of that south side. Now, again, this is a compromise because, of course, there were some historic preservationists that would have liked to have seen that entire section go bye-bye. Obviously, they were not willing to give that up because of the parking revenue. So instead, it was a little more of, I don't know if it was like 45 feet or how much it was, but it was, again, another compromise. There was a new parking ramp that was built, and part of the agreement that the city signed with First of America was that the city was to provide them a parking ramp for their employees. And this was when, of course, First of America had a number of employees in that building across the street from this. And so this parking ramp also came under the auspices of that Downtown Architecture and Urban Review Commission. And again, you know, with the brick and the design of it had a little more than what you would have seen in parking ramps typically designed at that time period. Salvation Army Building. Now this was an interesting story. The Salvation Army Building was purchased by Scott Dorschler, Messner, Gauntlet. The building itself was designed in 1927 by Ernest Batterson, a local architect. And the firm that got this project was King Scott, and they hired local architect Michael Dunn to help them on the exterior. And for those of you that have gone on walks with me when I've been by this building, I have said to you what a surprise to them was when they took down the Weber building next door, is that the Weber building and the Salvation Army shared a wall. And so what they had to do, what Michael had to do, is recreate a new wall on the south side of the Salvation Army. So you'll notice, you might not be able to see it in this photograph, but you can see a little bit of difference in the color of the brick between this front part and this side part. But he did a very good job, I feel, in replicating the crenellations up at the top and also the windows on the side. Now they're a little bit different size from what you might see in the rest of the building, but still I think it blended in well with the Salvation Army building. The West Michigan Cancer Center. And the West Michigan Cancer Center was, Deacon Mahammon was involved with the project, as was a Chicago architectural firm that did a lot with health buildings. And this was opened up in 1994. And the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. 1991 was when the governance of the museum changed from the Kalamazoo Public Schools to Kalamazoo Valley Community College. And in the summer of 1991, it's funny how you remember all these things. I just had my second daughter and went down, anyway. This program's been great, Beth, because I've been tripping down memory lane. Anyway, in 1991, they announced a $20 million campaign to raise money for the museum. And as you know, it was very successful, and the museum opened up in 1996. It was designed by, I want to say, William Johnson. It was interesting about this building because you'll notice that it's got this wide setback, which for them is very successful for them. They've got a nice billboard now out there, nice electronic billboard, nice little drop-off. But there's a story behind that. Because you also know that this is the one building that also extends over the mall on this end where the dome, the rounded area is. One of the reasons was poor communication. Because whoever was designing this building didn't talk to the people who were working on Scott Dorschler, Messner, and Gauntlet, and had no idea that this parking lot was going to be there. And that was promised to Scott Dorschler, Messner, and Gauntlet. It was only a 12-space parking lot, but it prevented the building from being brought forward. And so it set back a little bit, and then that's why you've got it over the mall. Initially, it wasn't supposed to be that way because they always wanted to keep the options open to open up the mall. And obviously, that's not going to happen when they built this building over the mall. So it was at that time when they pretty well knew that that block would probably not be open to traffic, but who knows. And then, of course, the festival site, which will probably, I'm sure on Sunday, was very active with the Susan G. Komen breast cancer run walk. In a couple of weeks, well, about a week from this weekend, 2 weeks from this weekend, we'll be very active with the Greek Festival and all the festivals that happen there during the summer. So we do have the festival site there. There's been some interesting offshoots from the main Arcadia Creek, Arcadia Commons project. Here we go back with the Phelps Bigelow building, the windmill building, 1876. And there is housing in this building currently. So there was a developer that got the building and made it into housing. And then we have this building right here, the old Coops and Paint Company, home of the Edwards and Chamberlain hardware store, built around late 1880s. There you have condominiums on the second and third floors, and you've got hospice, offices for hospice on the main floor and down in the basement. So those have been really nice additions, and those are certainly not planned when the development got going. Then, of course, you have the artwork that was installed on this, and we won't talk too much about this, will we, Sharon? No, we won't. Okay, anyway. Mark Lear's The Wheel of History that was installed on that. Enough said. Okay. One of the things that I'm sorry it was not able to happen, because this is one thing that we were promised, and it never really, as you can see, and it probably won't happen now. Here we have the Green Building, as I mentioned to you, 1867. Very, really nice, really, by the time we saw it, was like a pink brick building, Italianate building. And they had plans to keep the facade of the building. They knew that they were going to have to do creek work because, you know, we've got the creek running right through this area. But they said that the facade was going to stay. Obviously, they subsequently said that that would not work out. And here we have another shot of the building that I showed you earlier. There's the Green Building right there. So instead, we have these arches here. Well, when they took the original building down, the people who were developing this project said, mainly the people from the DKI said, well, we're going to recreate the facade. I'm still waiting. That's been like 20 years. No, maybe not 20 years, a little less than 20 years. But anyway, that's one thing that, you know, I had hoped, because there was a natural rhythm with those three buildings that you have there that's really gone when you have this sort of gaping hole right there, you know.
That used to be a building right there?
Well, yes, this building was there. They had to take it down, they said, because of the creek improvements. But originally they were going to put the original facade up, and then when they couldn't do that, they said they were going to put a new facade. But they never did. They said that they didn't have enough funding for it. And of course, the other thing that I guess this is the way things go. I wish that the creek had been like the way that they had originally planned for it, but instead we have this, which actually I was surprised with the falls. You get a little bit of water, a little bit more here. Why do I have a picture of a parking lot? Well, because very simply now, I didn't know that the Arcadia Creek, Arcadia Commons project is now known in downtown as Arcadia Creek East. And when they talked about the site for the arena, they talked about Arcadia Creek West and the development that's going to happen on Arcadia Creek West. Well, this is one of the places, the parking lot, the site of where the arena was to be. Exactly what the status of that project, I really don't know, but I still hear from various downtown entities about Arcadia Creek West. So exactly what's going to happen there, I really don't know. I know that some people have ideas of maybe let's bring the conservatory back and put it there. KVCC last week just announced a new culinary school, and they said it's going to be located in the downtown area. Whether or not they're thinking of this area, I'm really not too sure. But I don't know if this development will quite have the history and the color of the first Arcadia Creek project.